Good morning or afternoon to all of you, wherever you are, since I know that we are joined by people from different countries and even different continents. It's my pleasure as Director of EDEP to welcome you to this webinar on principles of macroeconomic planning, sustainability and health emergencies. For a number of weeks, not to say months now, all over the world, individuals, companies, governments, international organizations, NGOs, media, you name it, are all concentrated around one single word, COVID-19. And while this is not the first pandemic the world is faced with, actually, a few years back, we had in our region the Ebola crisis. It is the first one, unfortunately, or one can even say ironically, that is leaving no country and no individual, no community behind. And this is a real challenge for all of us. And this leads us to consider, first to realize how connected our world is, and how dependent on connections our world is, trade connections, financial connections, telecom, air travel, etc. But at the same time, how vulnerable we may be on actually this dependency of this connection. And this leads us to consider different maybe ways of approaching the development and the globalization, as we have seen the limits of what the solutions that have been proposed so far, and we need to figure out how best we can do in the future. And basically the solution that we are to find are not only to address today's crisis and emergencies, but also prepare properly and more orderly what we can call the day after, actually, the life after the pandemic, but also the life based on the lessons we have learned from this crisis. The COVID-19 is making us all rethink the word's economy and its macroeconomic planning, both from regional and country perspective. We have seen that actually no single country can plan and develop its development alone, independently of what is happening elsewhere. And at the same time, the regional and global dimensions are to be taken into account. Of course, today the news on the global economy shock are alarming, and all international organizations and organizations like ours are united efforts to quickly understand how to deal with a future that may be uncertain, a future the parameters of which are not fully mastered today, or we are discovering, I would say, new parameters of that future in a global world. Now, if we zoom on Africa, if we consider that Africa is expecting expenses worth a minimum of $100 billion to deal with economic and social impact of the pandemic, we realize rapidly that African countries need to anticipate the adequate measures to deal with the shock of the impact on their lives, and subsequently on the continent growth and people welfare, and in this case, a welfare that actually leaves no one behind in a positive manner. One of the measures will surely include adapting the macro planning to sustainability, how we can envisage the long term and a sustainable long term, with a view to successfully achieve Agenda 2030, the SDGs, and for us, African Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, and how we can plan more proactively when emergency arise, how to take the occurrence of emergencies and crises in our planning processes. Today, we are considering a health crisis, Tomorrow, the crisis may be the result of climate change, for example, issues or other issues. A few years ago, it was Ebola that we were considering, as I said. Now it is COVID-19. So African economies need to be prepared for any kind of emergency and economic shock stemming from different directions. And this is how the planning should be reconsidered and rethought. It is in that context that IDEP, the Institute for Economic Development and Planning, has decided to organize this webinar. And for those who may not know us, just a few words about IDEP. Since 1962, meaning we'll be almost 60 now. As per the country, the mandate the African countries and the UN ECOSOC has given us, IDEP has been supporting African government in improving their development planning and sector policy management. And all this with a view to achieve sound structural transformation. Today, this support is, of course, anchored in the delivery of Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063. And we work at country, regional, and continental level. And for example, if we look at what is happening at country level in an integrated and cross-sectoral approach, IDEP is working with the UN country team in Senegal to assist the country determine economic and social measures needed to address current and post-COVID crisis impact. And we envisage to extend the same level of cooperation interaction with other countries so that we can have a more global picture about what is happening in the continent. So as I said, this webinar aims at providing a platform to discuss the principles of macro planning as a result of the crisis. It aims at analyzing how the crisis can lead to a change in some of the macro measures and policy currently in place. Many of them have proved their limit. So we need really, as I said earlier, to define more parameters, new ways of looking at our level development and our planning processes. So there are a number of questions that would require a pragmatic reflection. Current growth rate regimes and the need to achieve sustainable and inclusive society in relation to resilient economies, monetary policies, inflation and lending to the economy, the role of central bank, the role of governments, the role of the IFI, fiscal measures and the need to restructure economies in line with social and economic goals, and a number of SDGs here are definitely concerned with this. How to keep debt sustainability and government financial stability, and we have seen that a number of countries actually are facing issue of liquidity. How we can reinforce domestic resource mobilization and be less dependent on external assistance, FDI, etc. How we can capture and build on the capital, the financial capital and resource capital that exists at the level of the countries, not only on the short term to face the crisis, but for the longer term to prepare the economic recovery, and a recovery that would more tangibly translate into a social dividend for everybody. So the solutions, of course, are to be considered and found at country level, but again, in a close discussion and a relation with other countries, neighboring countries at Africa level, but also more globally, internationally. I'm very much delighted to thank and introduce a panel of 6 eminent experts who have accepted to be with us today. Warm thanks to you. I know the solicitations are quite high these days, so thank you for making the time for being with us. And I will maybe like to do a rapid tour de table to give you the floor to just introduce yourself, and then we will go back to the panel and the various presentation. So, Mr. Bartholomew Arma, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Do you hear me?
Okay, Bart. So do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Bartholomew Arma. I'm running the macroeconomics and governance division of ECA, and we look at some of the macroeconomic dimensions of government policy actions. In this case, we've been focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its likely socioeconomic impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you very much. We will hear more later on about the work that you have been coordinating at ECA level and also in relation with the other regional commission and the UN system at large. The second speaker would have been Maika Oshikawa, but I understand that there are connection problems. We can be heard, but we can't hear. Is it the case? Still the case? Apparently, yes. It is what I can see in the chat box. Has David joined us, or is still struggling with connectivity? David? All right. So let me give now the floor to Dauda Sambet for his introduction. Dauda?
Thank you, Karima. My name is Dauda Semben, and I am an economic advisor at the Office of the President of Senegal. I was previously an IMF executive director, where I used to represent 23 African countries until 2018. And it's good to be with you today.
Great, thank you. And you will contribute with both a regional and a national perspective, which is very interesting, and the dynamics actually between the two levels. And I will now give the floor to Lena Savelli, the RC in Dakar, Senegal. Lena?
Hi, Karima, and good morning, good afternoon to all the participants. It's a pleasure to join this panel. My name is Lena Savelli. I am the UN Resident Coordinator at Interim in Senegal. I'm probably the only non-economist on the board, but I will be speaking to you on the work of the UN country team in Senegal, how we are collectively and together supporting the national plans and priorities in response to COVID. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lena. Welcome. And for those who are not familiar with the UN reform, actually, I just wanted to stress the importance of the role of the region resident coordinators who are integrating and harmonizing, I would say, the work of the UN system at country level and also in relation to the regional and global ones. So thank you, Lena, for being with us. I'm seeing that Maika is still having a problem to be heard, but contribution, she's offering to make contribution through the chat. So thank you for that. Don't hesitate to send your ideas, and we will share them with the participants. And I'm seeing that David Luke has just joined us. So David, we were doing a tour de table to introduce the participants. So please, it's your turn now. Please do it.
Yes, hello everyone, I'm David Luke.
David?
Can you hear me?
Faintly.
David, can you unmute your mic maybe?
You are faint, David.
We can see David connected, but we can't hear him.
Can you hear me now?
Very faintly. I can hear you very faintly.
You can hear David?
Yeah, but very faintly. Maybe because I'm using earphone.
No, I can't.
Very faint.
I don't know about the others.
Yes, I can hear
David.
David.
Okay. Shall I proceed?
I can hear him. Can you get closer to your mic?
Yes, I am very close to the mic. I'm speaking
At my
Yeah,
level,
I can hear him.
maybe I should also use earphones. David, let us welcome you, and maybe we can introduce you later on when you take the floor to make your own presentation. So let me straightforward move now to this webinar. I explained what we were expecting from it. So we will have a number of presentations for, let's say, 1 hour 30 maximum. The speakers will make so some 5 to 7 minutes intervention on the issues they are wanting to share with us, and then we will have a Q&A session through the chat with the participants. So to all participants, please do not hesitate to communicate your points and the various questions you have. So as I said, at the end of the session, you will also receive an evaluation questionnaire about the session. And I know the very first comment that will be recommendation number 1, improve connectivity in Africa. This is a recurrent one, but you are welcome to repeat it because it is an important one. So we will ask you to very kindly fill the form and submit it to give us the opportunity to evaluate this session. The webinar is recorded, and the material and the video will be sent to all of you later on once the session is completed. So it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Bartolome Arma, who will speak about the economic and social impact of COVID as analyzed by the recent report of the ECA. And we would like you maybe about to tell us what are today the main macroeconomic impacts of this crisis on Africa as of today, because we know that this is a very, very fast evolving situation and the analysis needs to be fine-tuned as we go on. And we would like you also to elaborate maybe on the social and health impacts. What is the situation today? What would be the recommendation on the way health and social expenses and dimension are to be considered when planning for development in the continent? What are the mitigation measures to reduce the impact, and how can we do better actually to have to be as performant as we claim we at the social level, as we claim we have been at the economic one in the continent since the turn of the century. So over to you, Bart, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon or good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you some of the work we've been doing here. I will focus my discussion on do an exhaustive job in terms of the social dimension, but I think that could come up also in the presentations, in the discussion. Now, just to look at the status of the pandemic in Africa, basically, if you, as of May 6th, the number of cases was around 51,000. And with about 1,680 deaths. This is relatively low compared to the other regions, as you can see. But the question is, what is the rate of growth? How is this progressing over time? And one cannot be complacent. If you also look at the deaths per cases, you find that it's relatively low in Africa, of course, based on the data we have currently. So the main point we want to make here is that Africa has a lot of vulnerabilities that makes us susceptible to the contagion of the disease, and therefore, notwithstanding the low numbers, we have to take into account the context. And what is the context? It is a context of where we have low testing coverage. There's not much testing that is going on in the continent right now. And really, testing and lockdowns are the first line of defense if you can't test, you don't know who the prevalence of the disease, and then you cannot isolate and then and contain. So testing per million in Africa is the countries that are doing quite well are South Africa, Ghana, to some extent Egypt and Tunisia. These are the countries that are doing a high level of testing. If you compare it to South Korea, for example, of 12,000 tests per million, we still have a ways to go. What are the vulnerabilities? First is access to hand washing facilities, because we know that that is an important way to stop the contagion. And the second is also the population density in the urban areas that makes spread quite high. We have nearly 600 million Africans living in urban areas, of which 56% live in slums. And only 34% have access to hand washing facilities with soap and water. So this is a challenge that we have to address in this context. Then the health systems are weak. If you just look at access to hospital beds and even access to doctors, medical doctors, it's quite low. And then on top of that is a situation where we depend a lot on import for medicinal pharmaceutical products. So our exposure to the disease in terms of the quality of our medical facilities and our reliance on external parties for imports of medicines and pharmaceuticals. And this, I take into account the fact that these countries have also been very highly hit, like Europe, the EU, and India are countries that have experienced a lot of, have been hit by the disease. So basically, given this context of growing prevalence, high vulnerability, what are the likely impacts on the economy? ECA projected, did an estimate of the likely impacts on the GDP, and it finds that if the original GDP growth for 2020 was 3.1%, and this is likely to drop depending on the degree of infections, were likely to be in the range of 1.1% growth in 2020 to negative 2.7% growth. What does this really mean in terms of people and livelihoods? There's a relationship between growth and poverty, as well as growth and employment. And if you use that relationship to estimate job losses and poverty, we find that 5 to 29 million people will be pushed into poverty, and 19 million people will be jobless as a result of the decline in growth. So these are quite sobering numbers, and really implications for the SDGs are that we're going to be thrown off the trajectory, which was not that great to begin with. Now, the transmission mechanism from the disease to our growth is really through commodity prices, which in turn affects our currencies. We earn foreign currency by exporting commodities, and when we cannot export, we don't earn as much foreign currency, which means that there's a shortage. When there's a shortage of foreign currencies, our currencies also depreciate relative to those currencies, which means that the cost of imports in local currency is going to be high. Sectors that are most hit include tourism as well. Beyond the commodities, tourism is an area that is going to be mostly tourism and transport industries. And Ethiopian Airlines, for example, which has a relatively high share of the market in terms of sea share, is going to be affected by this. It's estimated that they're losing about $500 million so far. The contribution of tourism to GDP means that countries like Egypt and South Africa, Morocco are going to be impacted by this situation. So what is our fiscal capacity to respond, given the impacts that we've highlighted so far? Well, the story is that African countries, as of 2008 going on, increasingly resorted to borrowing from commercial sources to finance the infrastructure expenses. So as a result, they were running deficits, annual deficits, which then accumulated into high debts as a percentage of GDP. So if you look at a country like, say, Mozambique, its debt is 100% of its GDP. Angola also has very high debts as a percentage of GDP, and Egypt also has a high debt as a percentage of GDP. What it basically means is that the capacity to borrow to address this disease is limited because you don't really have much room to borrow. What is interesting is that the dependence on commercial debt, which really happened because as a result of quantitative easing in the Western countries, they lowered their interest rates, which made their investing there less attractive. So private investors flocked the markets of emerging countries and bought the bonds that were sold. Now, which means that now the debt profile, which used to be largely concessional loans, is now increasingly including commercial debt. What does that mean in terms of debt? It means if you look at the yields here, we're in Uganda is, for example, paying 16% annually on its debt, compared to, say, Germany, negative 3.35, and the UK. So the debt profile is not more commercial and also more expensive to finance. So but in spite of all this, countries are putting in place measures to respond to the impacts. Largely, the responses has been in the area of social distancing and lockdowns, and as well as monetary policy, basically lowering interest rates to sustain and ensure that private sector has access to loans. But the question is, how effective are these measures, especially if you look at the lockdowns, in the absence of effective social safety nets? We've all seen how countries have had to unravel or reverse those lockdowns because individuals simply don't have to make a choice between surviving through not having enough food to eat or really dying through COVID. So these stark choices have made the lockdowns relatively ineffective and forced countries to sort of slow down on those lockdowns. And if you add to that the election year cycles that are coming up, the lockdowns have also, in a sense, been politicized. Now, if you look at the distribution of lockdowns, we find that most countries are engaging in partial lockdowns. Only 18 out of the 54 have full lockdowns and 11 have no lockdowns. Now, what is the relationship between lockdowns and actual infection rates? What we looked at the countries that have high levels of testing, like Djibouti, Ghana, Mauritius, South Africa, and then compared their infection rates over time. And we find that countries that have high tests tend to have relatively lower infection rates. So there is a link between the testing and the infection rates, which means that policy measures, whether be they macro or fiscal, have to figure out a way to finance the access to testing so that it can bring down these infection rates. Now, to sum up, the policy recommendations here are in three categories. We need to contain, we need to mitigate, and then we need to think about how we transition to a recovery. In terms of the containment, the key issue here is having access to the necessary PPE and medical supplies so that we can contact trace, test, contain, and basically catch the disease at its early stages. And when we do lockdowns, we cannot do them effectively without extensive testing because lockdowns only buy you time, but we need to use that time to identify and then identify those individuals that need assistance. In terms of mitigation, it's really about having access to funds. And here we're emphasizing the need for a 2-year debt standstill. We talked about the fact that the fiscal space of these countries is limited. Giving them a 2-year debt standstill means basically for 2 years they don't pay the interest on their debt and the principal. And this is going to give them some time to use those resources to then focus on addressing the vulnerable, the needs of the vulnerable, strengthening health systems, and also providing liquidity to businesses so that they don't go under. For example, if you take take Ethiopian Airlines, they're still paying for the leased airlines. These bills are coming in spite of the fact that they're not flying. So they need money to be able to sustain, to make those payments. Otherwise, they're going to go under, which means that more people are going to lose their jobs. We also need to ensure the soundness of the banking sector so that SMEs can have access to liquidity. And then there's also the fact that this disease is providing opportunities. We see that countries are repurposing their factories to produce PPE. These efforts need to be reinforced and supported. Now, as we move towards the recovery, I think in the area of health, one thing that is clear that we have to do is not to look at health system strengthening only from a health sector perspective, because the health systems require electricity. They also require access to water. But the major point here is that if people don't have access to hand washing facilities and sanitation, then the spread is going to be faster, and which is then going to further burden the health systems. If they don't have access to the health sector through communication and transport facilities, the capability of the health sector to support these people is also going to be compromised. So we need to look at health system strengthening in a more comprehensive and integrated way. We have also seen how this disease is also going to exacerbate the inequalities between educational systems that have access to technology and those that don't. So we need to revisit our education delivery mechanisms, and this has to be underpinned by strengthening the technology backbone such that the poor individuals from poorer and disadvantaged communities can have access to education even in situations of pandemics. But most importantly, we need to leverage the African Free Trade area as a basis for strengthening our manufacturing base so that our dependence on external sources for food and all part of the structural transformation and diversification agenda that we've been pushing. And hopefully this pandemic will actually have countries take this seriously. And lastly, as we do this, we also have to keep an eye on the climate. This disease has actually been linked to climate change. How do we ensure that we grow in a way that does not make us more vulnerable to future pandemics? So at this point, I'll stop here and take on questions as they come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bart, for your presentation and for having presented the current status of the work and the analysis of the ECA. You have presented the vulnerabilities, the impact mainly on economic, but also on the social aspects. And I think that one main takeaway is that we definitely need to rethink our priorities when investing in our planning for our development and investing for it. For a while, maybe health and education have not attracted the interest and the focus they should have. And now maybe we are paying the price of that low level of interest, and we need to reconsider that. Investing in people is key for the development of our countries, both at the literacy level, at the health level, the well-being level. So we need really to look at this. And we will have the opportunity to discuss some of the policy measures that are offered or recommended by ECA and see how feasible they are and whether they are enough actually to ensure good resilience and sustainable recovery and development later on. Our second speaker should have been Ms. Maiga Oshikawa, but I understand that we still have a problem with the to hear her. So basically what we wanted her to do, she was presenting on behalf of Ambassador Alan Wolf from the WTO. Basically what we were expecting was to look at the issue of global and multilateral trading systems, their role in development. We have seen here the dependence, the various relation with a majority of the pharmaceutical production, for example, being based in Asia. We have seen that closing borders very early has led to some crisis in the access to a number of medical products. Same for food, for countries that are depending on exports. Imports of food, etc., etc. So basically, today WTO estimated that the global trade in goods volume could decrease by 13%. So maybe through the chat, Micah can tell us whether this figure is still relevant and what it would lead to in terms of impact and in terms of international relation between countries. Also, tell us what lessons this gives us in terms of open and transparent trading systems, the importance of IPRs, the impact of trade in globally trade relation in the development issue. So now I'm seeing that you are saying that it would be that it is between 13 and 32% fall that is expected by trade forecast, meaning that the 13% was already, I would say, a low figure, and that as we go along, we can have, a global picture that can be worsening. So I'll let you, Micah, maybe write your various comments on the chat board. And while you do that, I'll give the floor to our third speaker, who is also going to talk about trade. It is our colleague, Mr. David Luke, who is the chair of the African Trade Policy Center, and who will tell us about trade in Africa, the impact of the trade crisis on trade, and also the relation to the African free trade area, how we can actually strengthen it and speed up some of its achievements based on the lessons the crisis is bringing to us. So, David, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Karima. Good morning again, everyone. I hope you can now hear me. I'm delighted to be part of this discussion, and I hope that what I have to say will complement very well the presentation from Pat. There is a PowerPoint. I'm not quite sure how that is being uploaded. Not sure if
David, sorry, we can hear you, but your voice is very, very low. So can we ask you to come a little closer to the mic and to speak louder? Because we are just guessing what you are saying and not really hearing. So please.
Yes, I'm literally over the laptop, and I hope you can hear me now, and I'm speaking as loud as I can. Can you hear me?
a little better, but it is not ideal. But we'll try to manage with that. I have put my mic at my speaker at the highest level volume, and I'll try to hear something, because I know that your messages are quite important. So please.
Yes. Okay. And let me also ask whether the PowerPoint presentation has been uploaded. The PowerPoint presentation is.
Hello. Sorry. Can you increase the volume of your laptop? The volume. Yes.
It's at the maximum.
No, it's not.
It's already at the maximum. It's I've increased it to the maximum. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, it's increased to the maximum. Is that better?
I don't hear you very well. Do you have an headphone plug in the laptop?
No,
Do you have any headphone plug in the laptop?
no, I'm not using a headphone.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Maybe he can disconnect and reconnect.
yes, maybe you can disconnect. Yes.
Seeing that David is trying to reconnect. What I would suggest is maybe while we do this, and maybe Pooh, you can try to have bilateral discussion with David. Maybe we can give the floor directly to Mr. Dauda Sambene for his presentation, and we will go back to David later on. So Dauda, please.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Karima. I believe we're okay. Thank you. I have my presentation actually on now. Let me start by thanking IDEP for this very timely initiative, and also very much, telling you how much we are pleased to have your institution in Senegal since 1962, and we very much appreciate the very good work that you are doing, including this session that will help us actually learn from experiences from other countries. So my presentation, as you ask, is going to be focused on the economic impact of COVID-19 and what could be optimal policy responses in Africa. And I certainly will be also talking about the case of Senegal. I certainly will be also trying to avoid to repeat what Bartolomeo has already said in terms of impacts, and try also to be as focused as I can to be in line with the time requirement that you actually told us. So next slide, please. So the plan of this presentation would be, of course, to start with the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19, and then go in a second section on the optimal fiscal policy response, and then the monetary policies and financial policies as they should be. And I would be ending my presentation talking about the case of Senegal. Next slide. So the macro impact, I believe actually Bartolomeo has already pointed out very helpful and useful information about what has been the impact as far as African countries are concerned. I'll be actually talking about three of them. First of all, the growth impact that he talks about. I think because of the lockdown measures, we have seen that there has been a sudden stop in real economic activity. And also, of course, a lot of disruptions in supply chains, which unfortunately has reduced economic activity. And that's the reason why it is already known that Africa will be in recessions for the first time for the past quarter century. And McKinsey is estimating that growth would be cut by 3 to 8 percentage points. And here, I think actually what Bartholomew has said is extremely important. It is that these are scenarios, growth scenarios, and that will depend on the severity of the crisis. How prevalent the infection rates will ultimately determine how much actually how severe the recession will be. Unfortunately, of course, as you all know, there has been a lot of economic hardships for both households and businesses, as illustrated by the many losses in jobs and incomes that many of them has already experienced. In terms of fiscal impact, needless to say that this year for many countries, the fiscal deficit will be out of control. It's a way to say that it is going to be deteriorated, the fiscal stance, as some of the reason would be, of course, the fact that there would be a lot of revenue shortfalls because of the crisis. Because of the reduced export performance, also, there would be actually less revenue for the government. And the response, the health response to the crisis will give rise to a lot of new spending that were not initially planned. And if you couple that with also the social safety net that needs to be developed, all of that will have a very negative impact on the fiscal stance of all of the countries concerned. And the other trend that we will certainly anticipate is that debt vulnerability will worsen in Africa. Before the crisis, there has been a trend in some countries where, of course, debt has been increasing in some manners because of their response to the crisis. Certainly, that trend will be continuing. In terms of monetary and financial impact, I believe what needs to be said here is that there would be a lot of financial stability risk that are due to the financial stress that households and businesses are experiencing. We certainly would expect a lot of financial soundness indicator to deteriorate, whether it is the profitability, the non-performing loans, solvency and liquidity ratio. And there would be also external stability risk that central banks needs to monitor and manage. I believe the previous panelists talked about the issues with foreign exchange rate shortages. There would be also, there has been already capital outflows that will also actually add up to those risks. And also the fact that the reduction of remittances will also add some pressure on the reserve position of many countries. Next slide, please. So what, under those circumstances, should be the optimal fiscal policy response? I also actually work as a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, which is based in Washington, D.C. And this is based on some work that I did for them a couple of weeks ago. Basically, in terms of fiscal policy, I think there is a need to clearly define the scope and composition of the economic response. When I say that, I'm talking more about actually the fact that the fiscal support measures that needs to be implemented to be cost effective need to be well targeted and well sequenced. And that needs to actually benefit mostly those households, workers, and businesses that are most affected by the crisis. That's for one. In terms of scope also, I think we have to distinguish two phases. The first phase is the containment phases that we are going through now. So long as we don't have the vaccine or the treatment, we will be actually forced to try to find ways to contain the crisis. But after that phases, hopefully that will come soon. We are really hopeful. There would be another phase, which is actually to resolve the crisis. And that would be actually how to stimulate economic recovery, how countries should be taking steps to make sure that they come back to the level of activities that they knew prior to the crisis. That would be another phase. Another priority for fiscal authorities would be actually to try to find financing options that are underpinned by realistic assessments of resource mobilization capacities. As you know, the crisis, as I indicated earlier, has actually created some revenue shortfalls. It also actually has forced many countries to do some budgetary reallocations, trying to actually reprioritize their budgets. And certainly it will also have some impact on the prospect for external financing, given the fact that actually many bilateral partners also are experiencing the same issues. So because of all of those reasons, countries need to make sure that they have realistic financing options that would actually fund their economic response. And one thing that really is needed, and every economist would tell you, is you need to have also resilient contingency plans. Because in the event that the financing that you're expecting falls short of your expectations, you need to actually do with what you have, and that's the need to have those contingency plans. And finally, you also, everyone would agree that actually responding to this crisis will require a lot of resources, because this is an unprecedented crisis and with an impact on with a very huge human toll and economic toll. What it means is that you have to have a large stimulus packages to make sure that actually at least you try to mitigate some adverse impact of it. And it means actually really strengthening your implementation capacities to make sure that you can do it appropriately. And when you do that, of course, taking advantage of the new technologies would help you, but you also have to make sure that you implement and you put in place effective accountability mechanism to make sure that at least, the response is appropriately implemented in an effective manner. Next slide, please. In terms of optimal monetary and financial policies, and of course, I'm trying to go as fast as I can, so that actually I won't take too much time, and we will have an opportunity to respond to questions later on. What most central banks have already done is to ease the stance of monetary policy, and that's the reason why you've seen actually all those policy rate cuts all around the world, not only in Africa, but all around the world, to stimulate demand and make sure that at least you support economic activity. There has been a lot of injections of liquidities. This is a way to make sure that at least you try to keep credit access adequate. And there are many ways to do so: open market operations, asset purchases, and loan and refinancing facilities. And these are actually the tools that are available to central banks. But I guess I will talk to you later on about it. Government also can inject liquidities, as the government of Senegal did, and I will come back to that later. We also need to address, the central banks need to address liquidity and solvency measures for households and businesses. As far as the central banks are concerned, this may consist of suspending or actually extending loan maturities or loan payments, and I will get back to that later on. Next slide, please. The case of Senegal, I think that's the most important aspect as far as I'm concerned. As you know, as soon as the crisis arose, what happened is the president of Senegal, His Excellency President Macky Sall, took a number of measures that actually was quite helpful in containing the initial phases of the crisis. First of all, there has been actually some measures to reduce mobility. There has been border closures. There also has been intercity restrictions to mobility. There has been also a curfew that has been introduced from 8 p.m. to 6 p.m. And that sort of is a way, actually, it's a lockdown measure that also push people to stay home at night. And also there has been actually, and that's the novelty of the Senegalese response, is there has been very effective and prompt health measures that were taken by the Senegalese authorities. There has been rapid testing of people who were potentially at risk. There has been also contact tracing. Whenever there has been someone infected that was actually found out, there has been a rapid measure that were taken to trace his or her contacts. And there has been also isolation mechanism, and that has helped actually a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons why Senegal also earned some praise. So, but this is still an ongoing work. We still need to do work more, and I think this is what the government is trying to do on a daily basis right now. So in terms of economic response, the government has put in place an economic and social resiliency plan that has 4 pillars. The first pillar is, of course, to support the health system, and this is all that has to do with testing, isolation, contact tracing, upgrading health centers so that they can host people with the disease. Awareness campaign has been also conducted, and the need to coordinate crisis response operations also. The second pillar was to enhance social resiliency. This is actually a pillar that had benefited the most vulnerable households. For instance, there has been a food program for 1 million households in Senegal. And of course, if you know that each household has many people, you can understand how many millions actually have been benefiting of this type of program. There has been also actually, this is one of another novelty of the Senegalese response, is to realize that actually diaspora members who used to contribute to the economy also are affected. So there has been a program to support those members through the embassies and the consulate. Of course, there are many other measures that I'm talking about, the temporary waiver of water and electricity bill, etc. And the third pillar was to preserve macroeconomic and financial stability with a view to supporting the private sector and protecting jobs. And here we have the write-off of the tax debt, the extension of tax deadlines, the domestic debt area clearance. And all of these actually, you can see, some of them are a way to inject liquidities for businesses, but also some households. And so it's not only the prerogative of central bank to inject liquidities. And finally, the fourth pillar was to avoid disruptions in supply chains in priority sectors, whether it is the energy sector, the health sector, the pharmaceutical, and the basic stuff, foodstuff. Last slide, please. And here, of course, I'm going to briefly talk about the central bank's response. As you know, the Central Bank of Senegal is BCAO, and it covers 8 YMO members. So what the central bank has done to respond to the crisis include actually improving liquidity in the banking system. It also broadened the collateral framework to make a certain number of bank loans eligible for access to refinancing. It also supported microfinance institutions, and it also promoted the use of digital payment. So I'm going to stop here, and certainly we'll have the opportunity to come to much more details on this during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dauda, for sharing with us your thought and your recommendation as far as monetary and financial impact and responses are concerned, and also for sharing the Senegalese experience. I think that what is interesting is that very early the government of Senegal has decided to implement a number of responses, some of them very strong ones, like the curfew, like the assessment of the respect of the measures by the citizens, etc. And this has been coupled also with an early set of decisions taken by BCAO that helped actually avoid a rapid slowdown in the economic activities and the financial transactions. So I think that these are interesting cases that will certainly raise a number of questions and generate a number of questions and comments by our participants, and I'll invite you later on to react to them. So I'm also asking the participant to start posting their questions so that we can have very targeted responses later on. And I'm seeing that a number of participants are asking for the presentation. As I said earlier, during my introductory remark, all the presentation will be shared with you, and we will also prepare a brief of this summary of the main outcome and recommendation of this session. I also am also informing you that that Mike Oshikawa, the representative of WTO, has sent us the speech or the remarks that were prepared by Ambassador Alan Wolf. And these would be also shared with you. It's a big document that will be shared with you as well. But again, I'm reiterating my invitation to Micah to share messages in the chat box if she wishes. I'm seeing that David is also back. So I hope that this time we can hear him and that the technical problem is solved. So David, over to you.
Yes, let's give it a try. Can you hear me? Any better? Hello? No?
It looks that we have not made a lot of progress. I don't know what's happening. Maybe do you see the speaker's icon? I mean, is it to its maximum?
Yes, it is. Can you
It
hear me?
is.
It's at its maximum. Yes. Can you hear me? No. Deeply regret this.
We hear you whispering.
You hear me whispering? It's at its maximum, and yeah, I'm at a loss to know what the problem is.
So maybe we can start by uploading your presentation.
Yes, please. Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Yeah, and I'll do my best to speak as loudly as I can. Once the presentation is loaded.
David, I'm seeing my colleagues advising you to close other application that may be using the audio channel, like MS Teams and WebEx, if you have had previous connections through these applications.
No, I'm not.
No, okay. So we will have to adapt to the very, very low.
Sorry about that. So we can go to the first slide.
Yeah, we are there.
Yes. The focus of the presentation is on how the crisis impacted Africa's trade and how trade could also be an important channel for the recovery. So basically, these are the two issues I wanted to focus on. And on this first slide, the message is very clear. Africa's exports are mainly commodities, and of course, this sector was hit very hard in the crisis with falling prices. Within commodities, of course, oil and petroleum exports dominate, and we know that prices have fallen considerably, as more than 40 by more than 40%. In the next slide, we're trying to show the. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, we're trying to show, for example, the situation in Nigeria. Nigeria, of course, being a petroleum exporting a petroleum exporting country and highly dependent on this commodity, where it's estimated that revenue from oil exports could be could drop by as much as 19.2 billion. And as we know, this sector has seen particular difficulties, and this, of course, applies to other African oil exporters, including Angola, Nigeria, and so on. Next slide. If you look at a promising sector such as textile and garments, with the lockdowns, shop closures, etc. This sector too has been hit very much, and offline spending on apparel, for example, in the EU, the US, and the EU being the two big African markets. In the EU, is estimated to have fallen by as much as 30 to 40%, and as much as 80% in highly infected regions, such as, of course, Spain, Italy, and so on. Of course, this also has a knock-on effect. Over 38,000 formal workers in Kenya, 37,000 formal workers in Ethiopia, and so on. Next slide. Um, Another promising sector, cornflowers, coffee, tea, similar message that these two have been hit, um, um, especially. Uh, um, Looking at cornflowers in particular, total collapse, near total collapse in demand for fresh cornflowers. This, of course, has impact on livelihoods. Estimated that this in Kenya is about over 100,000 people directly affected, and about 2 million people indirectly affected. In Ethiopia, 200,000 people directly affected, and potentially as much as 150,000 job losses. Next slide. The same could be said for coffee, cocoa, and same message. Perhaps we could move on to the next slide in the interest of time. And if you take an important services sector such as tourism and air transport, Bart has already touched on this in his presentation. Again, near collapse of the tourism sector with knock-on effect, of course, for air transport. And tourism is, of course, a very important part of GDP in many of our countries, especially the small island countries. It accounts for as much as 38% of GDP in Seychelles, 25% in Cabo Verde, and 15% in Mauritius. Air transport employs over 6.2 million people, and consequently, you can see that this sector too has been hit very hard. Next slide, please. We carried out this survey on how businesses have been impacted, and also how they're responding. Albeit this was a relatively small sample, but it did give us a helicopter kind of view of what is going on across business on the continent. And what we're finding that businesses themselves ranked the drop in demand as a major problem that they're facing, whether for goods or services. They also, the obvious point, lack of operational cash flow, reduction of opportunities to meet new customers, and further down the line, the many workers, of course, impacted, and so on. So businesses, from what they're telling us themselves, have been affected, as you would expect, by the crisis. Next slide, please. In terms of business capacity utilization, whether for goods or services, this has dropped, as you can see, overall for goods, about 30 to 40% capacity utilization rate; for services, 40 to 50%. And this range, applies to all businesses, whether micro, small, with small businesses, perhaps less so, but micro, small, medium, large businesses, all of which have been affected in terms of capacity utilization. But when you drill further, certainly businesses such as manufacturing, health, entertainment, utilities, transport, all of these have reduced capacities given the lockdowns and so on. Next slide, please. So we're also seeing, as now we shift the focus to talk a bit about recovery, we're also seeing that this crisis is an opportunity. Of course, in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was been a flagship development initiative on the continent with the aim of boosting intra-African trade. Before the crisis, much of the negotiations had been completed. In terms of trading goods, before the crisis, there was no prioritization that that health goods, personal protective equipment, for example, and so on, that these would be prioritized for liberalization. So that was not the thinking at the time. Similarly, one of the difficult areas of the negotiations was on rules of origin, where again negotiators were going in the direction of ensuring that originating inputs were mainly from the continent, and trying to establish high thresholds for this. Also, in regard to standards, the standards for medical goods were not being prioritized. In fact, it was more looking at standards for food-related products that were being prioritized, and so on. Trade facilitation, in the course of the negotiations, of course, looking to see how best the WTO TFA could be implemented on the continent, but not really prioritizing actions that are now needed for this crisis. But as I said, this crisis has become an opportunity. So for trading goods, it is still possible that as countries submit their schedules for tariff liberalization, that they in fact front load liberalization of medical products. The rules of origin, as they are being completed, could look at the value chain, the supply chain for personal protective equipment, for masks, for scrubs, and so on. And of course, there's still possibility now to again rejig on the standards to ensure that standards relating to these sorts of goods are front-loaded, and on the trade facilitation to ensure that customs clearance and for medical related supplies also expedited as possible to, for example, to have green lanes for these sorts of products. Now, so this could still be done in terms of the AFCFTA, but as I said, this has been an opportunity, and we are seeing the production of local production of these goods, as many countries, up to about 80 countries, are put to export restrictions. So we are seeing, for example, in South Africa, that N95 masks are being produced locally, as other manufacturing is being repurposed to produce them. Several countries are now producing testing kits. Hand sanitizers again become something that many countries are producing. Ventilators as well. A number of countries have repurposed existing manufacturing to do this. So this approach could well have a longer-term effect on the continent, as global supply chains can no longer be seen as fixed in terms of being especially reliant on certain parts of the world, and as there's a bigger push towards localization of production. So I think this is we have to watch this very carefully, but this is a great opportunity for the continent. If we could move to the next slide. This slide focuses on services, and again, on the right-hand column, the point that is being made is that before the crisis, the services sectors that were prioritized for liberalization were those that were thought to impact on manufacturing, especially with industrialization, be a key objective of the AFCFTA. And so sectors like business services, communication, finance, financial services, transport services were prioritized for liberalization. Tourism also prioritized for liberalization, but in the whole, these 5 sectors are sectors that are seen as contributing to the servicification of manufacturing, even the tourism sector, that much of the consumables is possible to produce them locally. Health services, education services, which are among the 13 established WTO services sectors, were not being prioritized. So there's an opportunity here to rethink and to see what could be done in terms of prioritizing these sectors. In particular, health education is going to become more important. We know that there are some countries that see education as a service sector where they could increase their exports in terms of bringing in students to benefit from the educational facilities. So this is perhaps a low-hanging fruit that could be prioritized in the discussions on services. Of course, the expectation under the FCFTA is that services is part of a built-in agenda, which means that sectors that were not prioritized could now be looked at, given what we have learned from this crisis. On the left-hand side of the column, it's also clear that for manufacturing, as I've said, we are seeing localization of manufacturing as supply chains become uncertain, that the sorts of services that can support this again is could be an important part of the services liberalization regime. For example, Indian manufacturers that have had travel bans and so on, which have limited their ability to support the production of medical supplies. So these are issues that could be looked at in relation to services liberalization. The same with health expertise. We do know that in the thick of the crisis, about 300 Chinese doctors and so on moved to Italy. So this kind of expertise which the continent requires, perhaps the scope to look to see how this kind of movement can be facilitated. Next slide, please. Next slide. Another area that has implications for the AFCFTA is, of course, e-commerce. Again, this crisis has shown us that the digitalization will be an important part of our life going forward. E-commerce is now formally a part of the AFCFTA negotiations. The negotiations were to proceed with negotiations on e-commerce. This was agreed at the last AU summit that was held in February this year. So it's very clear that we need on this continent to establish our own priorities on e-commerce, and build upon work that has already been done in regard to digitalization. We also need to see how our own approach on this continent could inform global level negotiations. We also need, of course, to ensure that we're taking a bottom-up approach so that SMEs, which are predominantly the types of businesses you find on this continent, can benefit. We need to ensure that we have a common regulatory framework, and of course, we need to ensure that we have interoperability of systems. Now, work that has been done in relation to the African digital strategy does look at these sorts of issues, but now, of course, the crisis has made this work urgent. The expectation is that e-commerce will now be part of the phase 3 of the of the AFCFTA negotiations, and that is to come after intellectual property, competition policy, policy and investment. So there may be a need to look at that agenda again and the way it has been ordered, and perhaps to front load the discussions on e-commerce, because again, very clearly, the crisis has told us that the digital area is one that we need to look at very carefully. And we are seeing on the left side of this slide that a number of actions have been taken during the crisis, which underscore the importance of this of digitalization. Just to highlight one of them, fast track mobile money adoption with M-Pesa waiving the fees for these transactions, of course, to encourage people to do online payments rather than with physical notes and the risks that those carry. We could move to the next slide, which is the last slide. And on this slide, basically, to round everything up, what one is trying to point out here is that the ECA modeling that was done on the likely impact of the AFCFTA, looking at 3 scenarios with a baseline and up to 2040, it was very clear that the potential and the impact on intra-African trade would be game-changing, and in particular that manufacturers, of which of course the medical supplies that I talked about is very much a part of through textiles, apparel manufacturing, that these will benefit considerably, irrespective of the extent to which these sectors are actually front-loaded in the liberalization commitments. So very clearly, I think Bart also made a point that as we look ahead now to economic recovery, the implementation of the AFCFTA is very much a part of what will be required, which means, of course, completing the negotiations, perhaps reordering the prioritization of the negotiations, as I've already said, in regard to goods, services, and e-commerce, so that going forward, the AFCFTA could actually contribute in a very dynamic way to the economic recovery. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this conversation. I do regret all the technical difficulties, but I do hope that you've been able to hear much of what I have said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Actually, at least as far as I'm concerned, I've heard your message. I can't say loud and clear, but it was clear. And I think that I like very much the last note that you left us with, which is that, of course, this crisis is a terrible time for all of us. We as individuals, our families, the institution in which we are working, the community to which we belong, our countries, the world at large. But at the same time, it can be seen as a unique opportunity to make sound and sometimes tough decisions on development priorities and planning. As I said earlier, redefine priorities. And as far as trade is concerned, it is really, it creates a real momentum actually to further boost African trade and intra-African trade. And I remember when discussing, I mean, ECA has been working on the AFCFTA for a number of years now, when the first analysis and figures were shared and broadcasted, people were thinking that ECA was over-optimistic in thinking that African countries can achieve those targets. But I think that now, either by necessity or opportunity, we have no other choice but achieve them and ensure that what used to be seen as just a motto, I mean, let us use the made in Africa, let us do a local consumption. I mean, today we have no other choice, actually. If you don't go to the butcher next door, you cannot bring food from outside, and you better keep in your zone of comfort and your immediate neighborhood. And this applies for a number of products in Africa. So, of course, the most immediate one, those that will ensure our food security and medical safety, but at the same time, we need also to move to more sophisticated products and encourage innovation, investment in science and technology, and protecting the innovation capacity of the country by sound IPRs. Okay, thank you very much again, David. Now we will move to Lena, because I think that even our colleague from the African Development Bank, Emmanuel, has power cuts in Abidjan and was not able to join us. So, Lena, to give us your own input on all this, to tell us maybe also more about how the UN system is working and addressing these issues. I think that, again, as I was saying, that the COVID crisis was a good opportunity to boost trade. I think that COVID crisis has proven to be an excellent opportunity to boost intra-UN collaboration, and we have seen generosity, solidarity, and cooperation being strengthened from all over the parts of the UN system. So, and of course, you will tell us more about the wonderful work that UN country team in Senegal is doing under your leadership. So, Lena, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Karima, and good afternoon and good morning again to all the speakers and participants. It's a real pleasure for me to join this seminar. Let me just stress that I will be talking really about what the UN country team here in Senegal is doing to support the national priorities and help the Senegalese people deal with the COVID-19 crisis. It is a particular pleasure to be on the same panel as Mr. Dauda, who has spoken very clearly about the many measures that the Senegalese government has taken, both to address the health crisis and to address the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. So on my first slide, let me point out that the photo was taken in Kolda in southern Senegal far before the crisis started, because we're clearly not enforcing any social distancing rules there, but we are in the middle of the community with which the United Nations is working. So next slide, please. So let me just start before going into what we're doing here at the country level. Maybe just reiterate the Secretary General of the United Nations vision on how to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. I'm sure many of you have seen this very strong statement that he has made, where he talks about this not only being a health crisis, but a human crisis, a job crisis, and a humanitarian and a development crisis, which is really at an unprecedented scale and demands an unprecedented response. The Secretary General has also cautioned that the viral contagion has become an economic contagion, and we've heard a lot from speakers today talking really about the economic impact that COVID-19 is having around the world. And that this prolonged global economic slowdown will have a negative impact on the implementation of our common agenda, 2030, the Sustainable Development Agenda, as well as the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So I will be talking a little bit more about the social impact of COVID-19 and less on the economic one. The UN country team in Senegal, we're a total of 27 resident agencies here, but of course the country team also includes a number of other agencies who don't have a permanent presence in the country. So we're a big team, and what we're trying to do is really follow the comprehensive guidance from the UN Secretary General and the organization, but tailoring it to the local needs and the context of Senegal, and following the 3 priorities set by the Secretary General. You'll see them below. We're talking about suppressing the transmission of the virus to control the pandemic, of course, of safeguarding people's lives and livelihoods, and lastly, to learn from this human crisis to build back. And the first speaker, Mr. Bartholomew, was talking about containment, mitigation, and towards recovery. So it very well is aligned with what the Secretary General is saying there in his 3 priorities. So what this really means is that we need to have even more collaboration and coordination today than we've ever had before. Karima talked about how we here in Senegal are working very closely, and we've really seen a more streamlined and coherent response of the UN country team under the leadership of the resident coordinator to bring these collective solutions, a coordinated multilateral response that really responds to the national priorities of the government of Senegal and which focuses on the most vulnerable communities, groups, and people. Next slide, please. So this is a bit the framework that we're working on here in Senegal. Obviously, the national plans are primordial. That is what we're guiding from the national context. And the government of Senegal has enacted the National Health Response Plan, which focuses really on the health priorities that came earlier. And then later on, they also launched the Economic and Social Resiliency Program, which Mr. Dauda spoke about before. And these are very much in line with the Secretary General's 3 priorities that we spoke about before. We also then guided by the 5 building blocks for which are included in the UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response of COVID-19, and you'll see them at the bottom. We're talking about health first, we're talking about protecting people, the economic response and recovery, macroeconomic response and multilateral collaboration, and of course, social cohesion and community resilience. So we've tried here in Senegal to be guided by this framework to really deliver this vision on the ground to support the government. So following the presentation of Senegal's economic and social resiliency program on 3rd of April, one of the first things we did as a country team was to start reorienting our actions to provide our full support to the national efforts. And this included taking a critical look at our UN Development Assistance Cooperation Framework, which we signed for a 5-year period with Senegal, and really asking ourselves the questions, with COVID-19 now being such a dominant factor in the society, what of our current activities remain relevant? Which ones are implementable? Are there other activities that we now should be doing that were not foreseen before, but really respond to the critical needs and the most urgent needs of the Senegalese population? So this exercise, which was undertaken by the UN country team in a collaborative fashion, everybody working together, was really critical to show the government and our other development partners that the UN is indeed flexible, we're responsive during a time of crisis. You may have heard the sort of popularly coined phrase of emergency development. We're of course a development context and we had a development plan, but we also need to be nimble, we need to be flexible, and we need to be responsive to a changing context. So on that basis, we have developed a UN preparedness and response plan, which is in line with the national plans, as well as the global frameworks of the Secretary General and the United Nations. And this includes both the UN support to the health response, as well as support to the economic and social resiliency plan. In terms of figures, the UN support is about $200 million for this year, which is a non-neglectable amount, and we have almost 3/4 of that funding mobilized already, which allows us to start with the implementation of critical activities just when they are needed the most. I will be presenting together with my colleagues from the country team this plan to the Ministry of Economy, Plan and Cooperation in Senegal tomorrow. We're working closely with a number of ministries who have on all our activities and really trying to respond to the key priorities that the government has set forth and to target the most vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. So just to give you more sort of concrete examples of what we're doing in terms of activities, along, like you see to the left, the 5 different pillars of the UN socioeconomic framework. Here are a couple of the multiple activities that the UN agencies in Senegal are doing in support of the government. We are actively working in support of the national health response, with, of course, the World Health Organization playing a leading and very strong role since even before the first case was detected here in Senegal. In the 8 commissions that are active under the Ministry of Health, we have a number of UN agencies, not only WHO, but also UNICEF, UNFPA, the World Food Programme, etc., who are playing an active role to combat and eradicate the pandemic in line with the response plan. Senegal is also eligible for funding from what's known as the Solidarity Response Fund, which is managed by the UN Foundation and the Swiss Philanthropy Foundation. So we are working together with the government to mobilize resources also from that fund to be able to support the response. We have worked, WHO, for instance, with WFP and the African Union have recently donated protective equipment intended primarily for frontline health workers, including gloves and goggles and surgical masks and other things that are needed. With UNIDO, we are supporting the industrial sector in the production of pharmaceuticals, equipment and other essential products, and also on the management and disinfectation of biomedical waste and upgrading of sanitary control laboratories for analysis. So we're really bringing in, based on all agencies' expertise and comparative advantages, bringing that to the table to best support the government's health response. Mr. Dauda spoke about the importance of communication and awareness raising, which obviously is critical to change the behavior of populations and limit the risk of transmission. In the community engagement and communication commission of the government, UNICEF is working to strengthen the communication. And UNFPA is also working in the south of the country to help install washing points in villages, engaging youth on responsible behavior for preventing transmission, and really trying to get the message out in support of the government's communication. The second part in going after the health response is then looking at the social and the economic dimensions of the pandemic. And here, the UN country team, under the lead of UNDP and EDIP, Karima mentioned it before, is working with the Ministry of Economy, Cooperation and Plan in analyzing comprehensively the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 in Senegal. We will continue advising the government on good practices to undertake to recover quickly and to establish better conditions for ending poverty and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We expect this report to be released on 15th of May. If there's a change, then I think Karima can correct me later. We're also very involved in mobilizing funding for Senegal, most recently through the Secretary General's COVID-19 Response and Recovery Trust Fund. We have just been informed that we have received $1 million for a joint project on ensuring continuity of learning for the most vulnerable children and youth in Senegal. And this was a proposal developed in just 1 week with 4 different agencies, UNESCO, UNICEF, ITU, and UNHCR, which really shows, again, this capacity of the UN development system to deliver quickly and to do this emergency development, if you'd like. A number of other initiatives are underway to really support the socioeconomic needs of the most vulnerable households. UN Women, for instance, together with FAO and UNFPA, have launched a program in working with the Ministry of Women, Family, Gender and Child Protection, which is called the Housewife's Basket, where they buy food from women producers to ensure that they still have revenue, and this food is then provided to the most vulnerable households in Senegal, which complements the emergency food assistance, which is being delivered at large scale by the government to, as Mr. Dauda said, 1 million households identified through the Social Protection Registry as being most vulnerable. Lastly, the third step is, of course, the recovering better, what Karima said, the life after, because we do hope there will be a life after. And what we're hoping then is that we're going to build back a world that is better for all, more inclusive. This pandemic has highlighted the importance of health systems, of social protection, and public services like never before. It has also highlighted and exacerbated inequalities, and above all, gender inequality, exposing the way in which the formal economy has been sustained through invisible and unpaid care work. COVID-19 also has highlighted human rights challenges across the world, including stigmatization and violence against women and girls, and the need to address the issue of the right to health. So really, everything we do now must be focused on building more equal, inclusive, and sustainable economies that are more resilient in the face of pandemics, such as the one we're currently facing, but also against climate change and the many other global challenges that we face. Next slide. So many of the real focus that we have done has been to focus and invest on the most vulnerable communities and people. Like I said before, we've already seen, and the UN has released a number of reports that talk about the disproportionate impact on women, including a rise in domestic violence, challenges and dangers facing children and young people who are out of school, the particular vulnerability of older people who we know right now are particularly vulnerable of the pandemic, but also risk being very isolated under the current response, and also the impact of the pandemic on the world's 1 billion people with disabilities. So I'd like to just reiterate that the UN response in Senegal will particularly focus on supporting the most vulnerable communities in line with the government plans, including the poor households, women and children. This includes a focus on social protection to mitigate the impact of the crisis. It also includes a response to protect children against the impact of and the increased risk of neglect, violence and exclusion, to ensure emergency assistance and support for the family and social reintegration of children deprived of parental care. It will have a gender-sensitive approach in all aspects, taking really into account the particular vulnerability of women to the risk of contamination and the roles that they are played upon to play in the family and the community sphere. And of course, it's going to be, as the UN responses always are, focused on human rights, including our core principle of Agenda 2030, which is to leave no one behind. So special attention really needs to be paid to those who are particularly vulnerable. We've had a lot of work done with the help of our Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights here as well, who has including been doing advocacy, which contributed to the release, the very wise release by the Senegal authorities also of some prisoners during this crisis, because they are particularly at risk of contracting the virus due to the high the congestion in prisons. So our support on human rights really concerns issues also of right to health, the right to participation, the right to information in the languages that you speak, freedom of movement, and issues related to xenophobia, racism, and discrimination. So I've already put up some of the key messages that really have come through on my presentation. And as we said before, the UN team in Senegal has 27 agencies and many more that are non-present, everybody with their own expertise and comparative advantages. And it's really that multi-sectoral response that we're trying to bring to bear to the government's own multi-sectoral response to address COVID-19 and to build back better with this inclusive, just, and resilient societies. More than ever, we really need to collaborate and coordinate. And the UN reform has enabled the resident coordinator to really take a strong leading role and gather up all the UN capacities in a streamlined manner. like I've reiterated many times, how we really must not lose sight of the most vulnerable groups and communities. We are only as strong as our weakest link, and we really need to make sure that those that are disproportionately affected by these crises will receive the assistance and support and protection that they need during this time. This is a core principle of Agenda 2030, to leave no one behind, and of course, a core principle of human rights of non-discrimination as well. So during the press briefing that the Secretary General had just last week, he quoted Jean Monnet, the French entrepreneur and diplomat, and one of the founding fathers of the EU. And he said, "This is not the time for blind optimism or paralyzing pessimism. Now it is the time to be determined." And I think that is what we are as the UN country team in Senegal. We're determined to support the government of Senegal and the people of Senegal to defeat COVID-19 and to emerge from this crisis by building a better world for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena. I mean, while ICT is excellent for communication during these times, actually doesn't allow us to clap at the end of your presentation, but I wanted actually to say hello. Thank you very much to all of you for what you have done in terms of presentations and message sharing. It was really very informative, but also very much telling in terms of the areas we should be focusing on for the way forward, so that the responses we are providing are last in the time and do not stop at the end of the crisis, but build something that will be more sustainable. One of the points that Lena made in terms of messages, in addition to the mobilization, the exceptional mobilization of the UN system in Senegal, is a message about the need to have a multi-sectoral response to address COVID and prepare a brighter future. And I think that this is also one of the main outcome of the analysis of the MDGs implementation, meaning during 2000 and 2015. One of the outcome of the analysis is that the people who failed to achieve the MDGs or were not as successful as they wanted in achieving the MDGs were the countries where departments were working in silos, not creating the necessary synergy among the various sectors. And it is exactly what we want to do now with when thinking about the future post-COVID. How can we have development strategies, plans, and programs that really involve all the sectors, create the synergy, have cross-cutting issues, involve the youth, the women, the people living with handicaps, the formal, informal sector, the private sector, with the NGOs and government, the academia, etc., etc. How, I mean, it is a shared responsibility. Each one of us has a role to play. So what we need to do is to maximize our contribution. For a number of years, all these communities and stakeholders were working, I would say, in a reactive mode. Now we need to move to more proactivity and be solution providers rather than testimonies of what is happening and bringing just testimonies and criticizing what is happening without bringing constructive options. So this is what we think the new planning processes should be about. So thank you again to all of you. I have seen that there were a number of questions, both in the chat box and the questions that this application allows us to have. So I don't know whether you have gone through them, but basically, if I can summarize some of what I have read, some of them, I would say a number of them actually are about the sustainability of the solution, both to address today's issues, but also to prepare the future. I mean, we have spoken about the income, the generation that was decreasing tremendously at the level of the countries, the fact that the spending is exploding because of a number of health requirements, food requirements, etc., safety, meaning how sustainable the measures are and how long will our country be able to support the pressure that is put on them. Is it something that they have to address alone? Is it something that the international community can help to solve? And how can the African cooperation be a solution and part of the solution? We have seen the trade. Maybe we can. You will want to develop some of these aspects. Actually, one of the very first measures and reaction of our member countries was to close boundaries and borders. And we have seen that, I mean, for example, the import of pharmaceutical products, it was important to lift some of these bans and to see. So we need this flexibility, and adaptability is very much important. And maybe it is also one of the recommendations of the approach to planning. The second set of questions that I have seen relate to how to address the lockdown. The extent to which, because in some countries it was partial, in others it is total. Is there an ideal solution? What are the parameters to define what a good solution are? And how can we exit lockdown situation for the countries that have implemented it? And what would be the time frame for that? Maybe another question, and this has been actually generated by Dauda's presentation, but also others' comments, is the capacity of our countries to take risk. I mean, most of the development approaches are defined in a sort of comfort zone. And somebody in the question was referring to the measures taken by BCEAO. And this applies to the banking system at large. Is it ready today to take risk, both with governments, but also with the private sector? Are they able to invest in youth or to invest with the youth? Are they able and ready to invest with and for the women? How can we deal with the informal sector? So these are a number of questions that have been I can feel in the questions that have been asked. And a last one that is a very concrete one: what about the testing capacity and the real assessment of the situation at the level of the countries? Because we have seen countries who had limited testing capacity, who were reporting very low contamination cases. But when the testing capacity increased and evolved, I mean, we have seen an explosion of cases. So we need to see how we can assist the countries for this situation, but also for the future. So maybe I can give you the floor, colleagues, for 1 or 2 minutes each to address those points, and maybe others that I may have missed in the question, the flow of question and the chat that I have seen so far. So, Bart, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the questions. There are quite a number of them. I saw on the lockdowns, I think this is an area that having a durable solution requires engaging with communities. Because we've seen situations where the lockdowns have unraveled because there's no buy-in by communities. So we need to bring in the community leaders to figure out the best way to organize these lockdowns. But that said, whatever the strategy is, it has to include an element of safety nets, of providing basic essential foods and other necessities to the communities, because without that, individuals will be forced to go out and look for resources. So really, this brings to the fore the importance of strengthening our safety nets. But then linked to that is the issue of targeting. You cannot have a safety net if you don't know the people that really need the safety nets, because everybody will try to avail themselves of those safety nets, but given the limited resources, you want to target the weakest. So here, one practical solution would be that you use this as an opportunity for individuals to get information about your informal sector. Where we don't have digital ID systems to be able to identify individuals, having households or communities register for these services gives you an opportunity to get information about your informal sector and use that information as the basis for providing these food items or resources or whatever that may be. Now, of course, you may get it wrong in the beginning, but at least that gives you a chance to begin to get an idea of what your community looks like in terms of identity and resources. Now, of course, lockdowns, like I said before, are only a starting point. You need to be able to identify who is infected and who is not. And so it has to be done in collaboration with testing. Now, there are a lot of digital solutions that are coming out. We had a meeting with a company called Wisdom Stone that uses digital solutions to identify hotspots, that is, individuals areas where the disease is prevalent, and they use data from medical facilities on infected people to be able to identify hotspots, and that then is the first step in identifying, in focusing your testing capabilities. So that is testing has to go along with the lockdowns. It has to go along with the community engagement in this process. On the issue of the tight fiscal space, which I saw was raised in one of the questions, I think this is an area where governments have to prioritize with the limited resources they have. But I think that demonstrating success in your containment measures is also a way to leverage your resource mobilization, at least your external resource mobilization efforts. I mean, this is not a time really the domestic resource mobilization efforts will be limited at this time because everybody is hit. But demonstrating success in terms of how your efforts are paying off could actually be a way to leverage your efforts in mobilizing resources externally. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now. I think those are some of the questions that resonated in terms of the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bart. David, do you want to continue? David?
Yes,
Oh,
yes, indeed. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, in regard to this issue of sustainability of the solutions, this momentum towards localization of production, which means regional value chains, and that countries should be prepared to take advantage of this emerging trend. You know, clearly trade liberalization is part of the answer, but it's not all of the answer. We know that. The issue of productive capacity is going to be key, and alongside that, of course, investment. But then the opportunity for investment has to go hand in hand with the diversification of global value chains, and to take advantage of that opportunity, as especially capital surplus countries are looking at how production can be diversified, and the possibility that Africa raises. But I think that the key to taking advantage of this opportunity would also be to have in place the energy supplies that are needed to support production. And here there's also an opportunity in regard to solutions like green energy, to solutions of investing in energy alongside investing in productive capacity. So I'll prioritize energy as crucial to enhancing productive capacity. But very clearly, going forward, I think that these solutions are sustainable, alongside, of course, the kinds of actions that are needed to enhance the trend of the increasing digitalization on the continent. So these solutions are sustainable, provided, of course, policymakers are able to harness these opportunities and take full advantage of them. As I said, there are a number of other things that you can prioritize. I think from Lina's presentation, we get a good sense of the whole range of issues that need to be addressed simultaneously. And as an ex-UNDP person myself, I have to say to Lina that I very much enjoyed that presentation, because it captured the essence of the UN and the best that the UN can pull together. So a number of issues that can need to be addressed, but this will be my prioritization: energy, investment, productive capacity to accompany trade liberalization and trade opening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your reaction to the questions and your replies. And I think that definitely, I mean, I can't agree more about the first key word that you have used, which is energy, since we were to have a speaker from the African Development Bank, actually, based in Abidjan, and he was not able to join us because of power cut in the area he's living in. So definitely we are actually hostages of our capacity to access adequate power. So not to mention the access of our industrial environment that is sometimes severely penalized by poor access, but also it is not about only access, but it is also about the cost of the energy in our countries, which is sometimes prohibitive, and that doesn't encourage investment, be it local investment or foreign investment. And therefore, I think that alternative solutions are to be found very rapidly, and those countries that have made the choice to move to green energy, be it solar, wind, thermal, need to be supported and to expand further their investment in this area, so that we do not always increase our vulnerability by depending on external factors. Thank you again, David. Dauda?
Thank you very much, Karima. before I respond to the question, allow me to thank Lena for her very informative presentations and also on the UN response to the COVID-19 in Senegal. And I would like to take the opportunity to commend the UN system in general and her team in particular for their valuable contribution to the response of the Senegalese government to this pandemic. We certainly agree that actually the UN framework for immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19 is closely aligned with the Senegalese health response strategy, but also the economic and social resilience program that the government has put in place. So very much appreciated, and especially the flexibility and the responsiveness that the UN system has certainly demonstrated during this difficult time. So that being said, I think in terms of the question, my understanding of the question is actually whether the central bank's measure will be effective given the fact that there are transmission mechanism problems in our countries due to the bank's aversions to risk. My response to this would be that I believe that the central bank's decision to reduce the policy rate will be helpful. Of course, it's 25 basis points. It certainly will help actually in the situation. But we should remember that actually it's not only interest rate consideration that would actually push banks to extend loans or not. There are other considerations. So I think the idea also that the central bank has been also pushing for a deferral of loan repayment and while making sure that actually from accounting purposes, actually the banks would be able to keep their indicators in a good shape. I think that would be helpful. But beyond that, I think also what the government has been doing has been quite also helpful in terms of pushing banks to be more confident in lending in this very difficult situation. In Senegal earlier this week, there has been an agreement that was sort of framework agreement that was signed by the Ministry of Economy and Planning and Corporations with the head of the banks associations. And through that framework agreement, what the banks would be doing is they would be actually extending liquidity assistance to businesses that are eligible to that framework, and the government would put money in the system, and also the bank also will contribute. I believe this is going to be helpful in terms of giving more incentives for banks to lend in this difficult time. I would also think that beyond actually what the government is doing and what the central bank is doing, what partners are doing also is extremely important. We have seen actually a lot of partners coming up with, in addition to, of course, the UN system, a lot of multilateral partners and bilateral partners are assisting the government in responding to this pandemic. And we believe that actually, as the UN has, the presentation has pointed out, this is the time to put the focus on collaboration and coordination for us to be more effective. And we certainly believe that if we all join hands and work together, there is no reason why actually the negative effect of the pandemic will be sort of contained sooner or later. I believe that's what I had to say in response to those questions. I think there was a question about what are the number of infections in Senegal. As of yesterday, the Ministry of Health had indicated there has been in total, since the beginning of the crisis, 1,433 cases that were detected, and out of those there has been 493 recoveries, which is quite a very good number of recovery rate as far as Senegal is concerned. Unfortunately, also there has been about 12 deaths, and Senegal is trying to do whatever we can to contain the situation. And to date, certainly with what the government has been able to do along with its partners, I think we are doing well, and we certainly hope, beyond Senegal, Africa, and the world in general will be able to contain this crisis as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dauda, for these elements of information and also answers to some of the questions that were asked by our participants. And yeah, I think that Senegal is doing relatively well in this area, again, because of the early reaction and action, and also because of the various measures that have been taken. And I'll give the floor to Lena, who certainly will reiterate the UN support to all the efforts that are being done by the country, and ask also Lena to react to some of the comments and questions that were raised by the participants. Lena?
Thank you very much, Karima, and thank you to the former speakers. Yes, indeed, I feel that in Senegal we're doing very well, and the measures that were taken by the government were not only very early on in the crises, but they've also been proportionate and have been adjusted and monitored as the situation has evolved. We're not in full lockdown mode. There is the curfew at night, as Mr. Dauda spoke about, but during the day, there's a lot of the regular economic activity that can continue, with, of course, with the measurements of social distancing, the wearing of masks and hand cleaning, etc., which allows particularly people from the informal economy, those living really on a day-to-day basis of this informal commerce, for instance, to continue their activities and not be as affected as they would have been in a situation of complete lockdown. So the measures have really been measured and proportional. And this brings in also the aspect we spoke about before about human rights and ensuring proportionality, ensuring right of participation in information, having different stakeholders express their needs and their concerns so that these can be taken into account when you formulate the government policies and put in place new measures. So I do think that that has been upheld here in Senegal, and we congratulate the government for that. Coming back to the point of social protection, which Bartholomew mentioned as well, which is really critical during this time, the most vulnerable being affected by the COVID crisis and the economic and social impact of it. And I think in Senegal, what has been really a benefit for Senegal was that they had made such strong investments in social protection even prior to the crisis. The launch in 2013, I believe, of the president's Bourse de Sécurité Familiale, which is a social protection system, which already has almost 500,000 beneficiaries, enabled the government to very rapidly, when targeting who is the most affected by the crisis, make use of this Registre National Unique, the national registry for social protection, to very quickly save time on targeting and enable the food assistance and other assistance to be provided to the most in need. And I think that's an important lesson to learn for countries all across the continent, that social protection, as we said before, and public services are essential and they need to be put in place. And the countries that have those in place are slightly better off, I would argue, than those that do not have so. So just to reiterate the social economic of this crisis, some of the figures that we've been hearing from the UN is ILO saying that up to 300 million jobs around the world can be lost due to COVID-19. That 500 million people can become poor, fall into poverty. And that's the first increase that we've seen in poverty rates for the past 3 decades. And this is really a very, very serious matter. And lastly, World Food Programme and FAO and others cautioning that up to 130 million people around the world additionally can become food insecure due to COVID-19. So truly this multilateral response, truly this coordinated response with the focus of the most vulnerable is essential if we are going to exit of this crisis and build back a better society for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thank you all for your comments and answers. I'm seeing two questions from Samuel. The first one being whether we think that the crisis is an opportunity to rethink our development system. Actually, it is the whole purpose of this webinar, to learn from the crisis and see how we can reorient some of our priorities, some of our development programs and plans, how we can also rethink our bilateral and multilateral ties and connections and relations, because this has also brought to our attention weaknesses and strength in those connections and bilaterals, and international cooperation is a very important element there. But African integration and regional cooperation is also one of the priorities. And you have also said asked something about the way Senegal is reacting and its capacity to react. So Dauda and Lena have already provided elements to this question, but I think that the most important element is the ability that the government of Senegal has proved to adapt to a fast evolving situation. We didn't have a set of action since day one. There were the action for day one and the first period. And then as we moved along and the pandemic developed, the government has taken different measures, other measures, additional ones, some of them centralized in Dakar, others with the support of the region. But what's talking about the importance of involving communities. Here, for example, the religious communities have been very much involved in the discussion, in the implementation of the measures, because it is good to take measures, but I mean the likelihood of these measures to be implemented is also a real challenge in some countries. So it was important to take the right measures at the right time to make sure that they are followed by action and adequate action, and to have people assessing also softly, sometimes less softly, the implementation of those measures, whether people are respecting the curfew, whether they are respecting the utilization of the masks, the social distancing, etc., etc. So I think that there is no, I would say, predefined recipe. There is no miracle recipe. And I think that what is important for our countries, and this is for us a key in the planning, the approach to planning, is their capacity to adapt to different situations that change, to be able to take, not to consider their development as a linear curve, but to try to see inflection points when crises emerge, and to be able and ready to address those inflection points and those new orientation in the development choices and priorities. And for few decades, I mean, during the 80s, 90s, investment in social areas was not very much encouraged by our partners. But now we know that if we don't invest in people, in their health, in their safety, in their food security, in their security, I mean, we can actually expect extreme situation to occur, be they a result of, as we are talking today, of health crisis, be they the result of potential climate change problems, be they the result of extremisms and a number of security threats that we have in the, for example, in the Sahel region, etc., etc. So I think that Lena said we have to be nimble. Definitely, we have to be conscious that there may be situations that we can't anticipate, and be prepared actually to adapt a development plan to those kind of situations. I wanted to thank all of you for your participation. We were planning 1.5 hours and we have reached 2 hours and a half. So I think that we also need to improve our internal planning, time planning and management capacity. But the subject was interesting and important enough, and the expertise of our speakers was excellent. So I didn't want to cut them short, and I let them take as much time as they needed. All the presentations that were made will be shared, and we will send all the participants a link to that. We will also have a summary of what has been said. I wanted to thank Maika for staying with us, even if she was not able to communicate orally, but we have taken note of the points you have made, your readiness to work with ECA, and the Africa Free Trade Center, and to work on trade-related issue and how they can support the various opportunities to further strengthen and accelerate the development of our countries. I think it was important to have also a representative of a government through Dauda, and the partners of a government through Lena. And I think that this is how we can move together more efficiently, with all the actors being fully engaged and assuming their role. It is a team work, a huge team, very heterogeneous team, but I think that a team that shares a common goal, the goal of building a brighter future to our children, our people. And we have seen that while for a number of years and decades, economic indicators were the main barometers for evaluating the development and the performance of a country. Now we cannot but agree that we need to have people and human-centered planning programs and development programs. Our colleagues have prepared for you an evaluation questionnaire with a number of questions, but of course we could not maybe anticipate all the comments that you will have. So please do not hesitate through that questionnaire, and later on through contact with my colleagues, to come back to us with your comments and suggestions for this webinar and other issues that you would like maybe to further develop with us. So once again, thank you all for your participation, wherever you are. Thank you to our speakers. Thanks to my teams in the training and research division and knowledge management and e-learning division and the administration of IDEP, who have organized this webinar. I wish you all a good day, and keep safe and take care of yourself. Bye-bye. À bientôt. Dieu le Jeff.